This is the first lecture in our Law, Politics, and the Media lecture series, which is co-sponsored by IJPM and the Carnegie Legal Reporting Program at Newhouse. This lecture series is tied to a course on law, politics, and the media. It's cross-listed at the College of Law, Maxwell, and Newhouse. Draws graduate students and some undergraduate students from the three schools. And like the lecture series, the course is co-sponsored by IJPM and the Carnegie Legal Reporting Program. Roy Gutterman, who directs the program, is seated to my right. The lecture series will be bringing out 8 speakers over the course of this semester who are drawn from the 3 fields of interest. We tend to emphasize practitioners, sitting judges, working journalists, policymakers, all of whom have something to say about the intersection of law, politics, and the media. Today we are fortunate enough to have with us Amy Bach. Amy Bach is a graduate of Stanford Law School and a member of the New York Bar. She's written journalism on legal issues for The Nation, The American Lawyer, and New York Magazine, among other publications. She has been at work for some time on a project about ordinary courts in the United States, and a project that yielded this book, just published in 2009, called Ordinary Injustice. In the research and writing of this book, Amy Bach was awarded a Soros Media Fellowship. She received a J. Anthony Lucas Citation and a Knight Fellowship, Knight Foundation Journalism Fellowship at Yale Law School. She also is a recipient of a Radcliffe Fellowship. She, upon publication of this book, has been zipping all around the country, talking about it, making appearances, and the book has been very well received. Stanford Law School, her alma mater, I've just learned, has now assigned Ordinary Injustice as required reading for all clinic students. So this is now entering the curriculum, one of the leading law schools in the country. She was also a recent recipient of the Green Bag Legal Writing Award. Those of you legal academics and law students out there know the Green Bag is a distinguished journal of legal scholarship and legal opinion. She will today speak to us about the book, Ordinary Injustice, and her lecture is entitled The Problem of Ordinary Injustice, Reporting on Ongoing Systemic Problem. Now, Amy's going to come up here in a second. As she starts to speak in the background, Shannon Yohani, our graduate student at IJPM, will be setting up a large banner that says IJPM on it. That's right, IJPM. Did I mention that IJPM is co-sponsoring this event? So as Shannon does that, I just want to let you know this is anticipated. This is not something that I'm not calling security. This is part of the plan. As Shannon is setting that up, please join me in welcoming Amy Bach.
That's beautiful.
Worth the effort. Well, we don't want Amy to knock it over.
I won't make large hand movements.
That's great.
Thank you, Keith and Roy, for having me. I'm here today to talk to you about reporting on the ordinary. The ordinary has no place on the front page if you believe that the definition of news is news. And by news, I mean what makes the day different than any other day. I posit to you, however, that there are places in America where the ordinary has become so degraded that it is in fact extraordinary, or ends up in extraordinarily catastrophic consequences. Without someone to shed light on the state of affairs, it will go on until it does hit a front page. And suddenly people ask, how did this happen? In courts across America, what has become ordinary is our collective failure as lawyers, journalists, and citizens who pay for and experience our court systems. Now, what am I talking about? A good example of a front page story that should have been reported on years before is what happened in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. 2 juvenile judges were found to have taken millions of dollars in kickbacks in exchange for sending children to a private prison. Yes, this is newsworthy. But what is amazing and astounding is that the court operated for years without attorneys standing up to do something and without serious media scrutiny. For years on end, child advocates noticed the judges who didn't read children their rights. The judges didn't assign attorneys to children who arguably would need a lawyer most, and held sentencing hearings where kids had no advocates and lasted under the sentencing hearings lasted under 2 minutes each. And the judges gave outrageous sentences, like wilderness camp to a girl who had lampooned her principal on her MySpace page. For years on end, this sort of ongoing injustice happened, and attorneys watched it every day, but the problem never made a sound. This is what my book is about. Courtrooms in America where an injustice is allowed to continue ad infinitum until the situation becomes so bad that one person was blamed. In the case of Wilkes-Barre, there were 2 judges who were blamed and who ultimately took the fall, and perhaps rightly so. But there was a legal community who kept those judges in place, who turned a blind eye to daily flouting of rights in the law. They let children go to prison for crimes that didn't merit it, and they never said a word that made a difference until outside investigators figure it out. Now, how does one become interested in the ordinary? There are times, I believe, that the ordinary can jump out at you. This is what happened to me. So now I'm going to take you back to the beginning of my book when I decided to write a book about the ordinary. It was 2001, and I had just graduated from law school at Stanford, and I had clerked for a federal appellate judge in Miami. And there the jurisdiction is Florida, Alabama, and Georgia. And I got an idea to write a story about a voting rights situation in Alabama. And so after my clerkship, I wrote this story for The Nation magazine, and it was widely picked up. And The Nation said, you know, we're so pleased with how you did this voting rights story. If we gave you a year to write about civil rights, would you come work for us for a year? And I said, that sounds great. It sounded a lot better than going to work for a law firm or making a serious career decision. It felt like it was just going to be a year. So I proposed a bunch of different stories, and then my editor would send me off to wherever I proposed. And I decided I wanted to write something about indigent defense in Georgia. And the reason why was because there were a bunch of lawsuits being filed saying that there was a problem with the way that attorneys were being assigned to defendants, and in general that there were widespread problems with the way that defendants were being represented. So I decided to go to a court in Greene County, Georgia. Now, Greene County is a beautiful place. It has a large lake there, and President Bush vacationed there 3 times during his presidency because his largest fundraiser lived there. So I pull into this beautiful place, and there's this cute-as-a-button courthouse. It looks like something out of a setting for a John Grisham novel. Long, dark, creaky benches and hardwood floors and perfect moldings decorated with little stars all around it. And I walk up the green carpeted steps, and I see the public defender standing there. He's a man named Robert Surrency, and he has red tousled hair, and he's wearing a loose suit, and he looks really overwhelmed because he has a crowd of people surrounding him. And they're all waving papers, and they want just 2 minutes to talk to the public defender before they are supposed to go before the judge. So the way that justice worked that day was that the public defender would read from a list what the plea bargaining offers were, and then the person was expected to go before the judge and plead guilty with another lawyer who knew even less about the case than Robert Surrency did. Now, people had things that they wanted to talk to Robert about, and he would say, you know, if you're not going to plead guilty today, you have to come back another day. And so some people got up and said, I'm not prepared to plead guilty today. But most people sort of were going along with whatever the judge was asking. When the judge asked them a question, they would say, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am. And all of a sudden, at the end, when they were pleading guilty, they would say, wait, I didn't realize I was pleading guilty. Or someone said, I didn't realize I was going to jail today. And in this way, court really looked like a mess. And I would run out afterwards, follow the people back and say, tell me what happened in your case. Did you talk to the public defender? And they all said the same thing. I called him. I'd never heard back from him. He would only talk to me in the hallway. And so what I come to learn was that the public defender had twice the number of cases that the American Bar Association recommended as the absolute maximum that a lawyer can have. And that day, I watched him plead 48 people guilty in one day. When I asked the judge and the prosecutor and defense attorney, I said, so how do you think things went today? They all said the same thing. Fine. And in fact, Robert Syracuse boasted. He said, look, we have successfully done a 10-page calendar in one day, as if speed equaled success. Now, what astonished me and what made me want to write a book is that there were these smart, committed, hardworking professionals, but they were routinely acting in ways that fell short of what it is that people in positions were supposed to be doing. And they didn't even realize that anything was missing, or that their behavior had really devastating consequences for ordinary people's lives. This is ordinary injustice. Mistakes become routine, and legal professionals can no longer see their role in them. Now, there was something else that happened that day in court. As the day went on, it became increasingly harder to hear, and the judge and the prosecutor and the defense attorney were all huddled together at the bench. It looked like they were on the same team. And as they were huddled together, it became so hard to hear them that people were creaking in those dark wooden benches. And so I was trying to take notes for my story, and I couldn't hear anything. And the man sitting next to me is a man named Steve Bright. He's head of the Southern Center for Human Rights in Atlanta. And he had come to court that day because I told him that I was doing this story, and he said, well, I've never been to Greene County. I'm going to come sit next to you. So Steve turns to me, and he says, and he's also, Steve, let me say, he's a little bit famous. You may not know his name, and you may not recognize him, but in Georgia, he's famous, and he's on Nightline. He's somebody who is always in the New York Times. So Steve turns to me, and he says, Amy, why don't you ask the judge to speak up so you could hear and you could take notes for your story? And I said, Steve, I'm not going to do that. I am a journalist, and I was just embarrassed to do it. I didn't want to raise a ruckus. So I continue taking notes, and Steve raises his hand, and he says, Your Honor, if you wouldn't mind, please speak up. Thank you very much. And he sits down. And the whole room just shifts and looks at him like, who was that? It's like a pall comes over the place. And Steve, the judge says, who are you? Please come before me. And Steve sort of crouches up again and says, no, Your Honor, we just want you to speak up. Thank you very much. And sits back down. She orders him to come before her. And he stands before her, and he basically takes over the courtroom. He's a great trial lawyer. And he says, Your Honor, we're all here. We're missing our work. We've left our children in the care of others. This is a public hearing. If you wouldn't mind, please speak up. And the place went wild. People are clapping and saying, amen, and that's right. This is our right to hear. This is a public hearing. And the judge, bangs on the gavel and says, okay, we're going to take a few-minute break. Everybody runs over to Steve to say, who are you? Will you represent me? and talking to him about their cases, and he's giving names of lawyers who could. Judge gets back before the bench. She says, all right, I'm having a microphone installed, and someone's installing this microphone, and then she says, can everybody hear now? And people in the back say, no, we can't hear you. And she says, can you hear me now? And all of a sudden, everybody could hear him. For the rest of the court day, that was not a problem. Now, I went back to court for the next 5 years. And there was never another microphone. Not only in her court, but in several other judges' courts. I sat and watched. And there was always that huddle. And there was never another microphone. That huddle is what my book is about. It's about how professionals, people like me, like some of the people in this room, and like the ones that you're going to become, who become more attached to the people we work with than performing the checks that make the adversarial system work. Now, by adversarial system, what do I mean? I mean the prosecutor against a defense attorney and a neutral judge above, all right? Now, this is what you see on Law and Order. This is, the prosecutor who's sitting around with his friends saying, we had the police go out there, but I'm not sure they did the right thing. I think this is really the guy, but we need a little more evidence. And then they send out investigators to do more work. And the defense attorney, he looks at the case and he thinks that they're wrong. And he goes out in his car and he stops at the garbage and he picks through. And then he goes and knocks on doors to talk to witnesses. And the judge who throws evidence out because based on hard calls, people's rights have to be protected. This is what you don't see in my book. Okay, none of that. My book is not about that. Now, after I was in Greene County, I decided that I wanted to write a book about how ordinary people were treated. And I began to look around the country for this huddle. And the book ultimately took me 8 years from start to finish. And the reason it took me so long to figure out how to write about the huddle and the ordinary injustice that results from it is because ordinary injustice is often misdiagnosed as a bad apple problem, all right? We blame one person. And there is no better example than what happened to Robert Syracuse. All right, so I write the story for The Nation magazine on Robert Syracuse. And based on that story, Robert is called before an indigent defense commission because the state, as I mentioned, was having all these problems. And Robert testifies. And he says some things that were misguided. He said some things that made him look like he wasn't representing his clients properly. He said something about all of them being guilty. And the newspaper wrote a story about this and then went and sat in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, sat and watched him in court and saw him doing some strange things like referring to himself in the third person and not knowing his clients' names or their faces. And so the Atlanta Journal writes this story about him, and Robert Syracuse has to leave his job. Now, the irony is that because I stayed in this story for 5 years, 6 years afterwards, I got to see that Robert Syracuse ended up, by a comedy of errors, working for the best public defender in the entire state. A couple hundred miles south. Her name is Terry Everett. And she had set up a system where the lawyers had to make motions to get fines eliminated. They had to visit the jail as soon as they got into work and before they left at the end of the day to talk to clients. And she checked on them to make sure that they were doing everything that they had to do. She also recommended they use an investigator. She provided an investigator. And when I went to her and I said, "So you hired Robert Syracuse, And she said, "He's fantastic. He was held up as the poster child for being a bad lawyer and for being, he was for representing people poorly. But let me tell you something. This guy's winning his cases. He's using an investigator more than most people." So I went to Robert Syracuse and I said, "Do you remember me?" and we talked and we talked. And he looked vibrant, he looked great, and he was happy. And I said, "So do you see how much better you are than this one?" And he said, "No, this is the lawyer I've always wanted to be. This is the lawyer I always was then. I'm still the same person. I was always doing the best for my clients." The point is that in the case of Robert Syracuse, I and the press in general got it wrong at first. He was never a bad apple. He was the product of a bad system. But we don't portray systems well in the press. We don't know how to report on them. We don't know how to report on the ordinary. So, how do we as members of the press prevent ourselves from falling into the fallacy of the bad apple for important cases? Now, in retrospect, I can give you my prescription of what to do whenever you are presented with a potential bad apple situation. It's a long process, and it comes down to 3 basic steps. First, you need to understand what the basic problem is. For these, you need to find the stories of the people affected, the victims, the defendants, or whoever. In Greene County, it was the people I talked to in the hallways telling me that my attorney won't meet with me. It was also the regulars, the people who got arrested continually for drugs, who could tell you how the public defender treated them repeatedly. One woman I met had been arrested for cocaine and used the public defender before. She worked at Wendy's, and she had hired a lawyer for her second arrest for cocaine because she said that Robert just wouldn't do one thing for him. Now, I believe not just her, but those who repeatedly said the same things over and over. And once you find this repetition, you can start to find professionals as well. The paralegals, the court clerks, the attorneys, all of whom are repeat players in the courthouse. There will be people who are exceptions to the ordinary, who can see what those who are part of the perpetrators of ordinary injustice cannot. But you first need the stories of the people affected, because a lot of the people who have tried to stand up have been smacked down, and they're a little harder to find, but you can if you first find the people affected. All right, second, and this is crucial, you have to find a number out of proportion. An attorney like Syracuse representing twice the number of people that the ABA says is the absolute maximum that a lawyer can do. That's a number out of proportion. A pattern of a judge who gives outrageous bails for teeny-nothing crimes. There's a number out of proportion. A prosecutor takes very few cases to trial and screens out almost everything else, refusing to prosecute for no apparent reason. Look for that. And it's your job to find this pattern. And once you have this pattern, you can go to the third step, all right? And this is the most important and daunting part. You've got to get down to the basics, to concentrate on the ordinary, to go as low as you can go on the food chain. In the case of courts, to talk to the people who are part of the systemic inertia. All of the players have to be talked to, the judges, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the court clerks, the county officials, and even the guard who sits in the hallway and knows better than anyone else how things work. You're looking to see, in their own words, how injustice works. They're your best sources. Because so often, they don't know any other way to do injustice or justice. They will just tell you, point blank, their intentions. Now, I want to tell you, I'm going to take a step back here. I want to give you a glaring example. And this was, in my mind's eye, the glaring example when I reported ordinary injustice. I thought about Texaco. I thought about a case where critics of affirmative action had argued routinely that discrimination is now dead and it doesn't exist anymore. But yet there were these African American employees of Texaco bringing a federal suit in 1994. They charged that Texaco discriminated against them and created a racially hostile atmosphere. Now, this lawsuit brought by these African American Texaco employees, it was just plodding along, sort of going nowhere, until a man whose job it was to regularly take notes at executive meetings was laid off. And he handed over tapes he was transcribing to prosecutors. And on the tapes, executives were caught deriding minority employees in racist terms and plotting to destroy documents in the federal discrimination case. Senior executives, including Texaco's former treasurer, freely derided black employees as niggers and black jelly beans. This executive also belittled the interests of black employees in Kwanzaa, an Africanist celebration held in December. He said, "I'm still having trouble with Hanukkah. Now we have Kwanzaa." Just regular conversation after a meeting. Now here's the beauty of those tapes. It's one thing to have a bunch of African American employees saying they weren't promoted based on race. But it's another thing to be inside the executive suite, showing from the top how the system is run. It's your job to get inside the executive suite. Now, how do you ask, am I supposed to get inside the executive suite? That was a stroke of luck for federal prosecutors and for the New York Times that broke the story. Well, you can't have a secret tape every day. But you can do this. You can go around to the people who work in the system and say this. Tell me about what you do every day. Tell me about your work. And when you understand exactly how this person's day is spent, what time they go to work, where they sit at the desk, how open the office door is, who works for them, and what various underlings do, then you can begin to decide what the story is about. Why did you decide not to talk to witnesses? How often do you behave this way? What are the basics of your job? Tell me about the ordinary. Now, you can do this by spending time with them. You call and you call and you call, and you basically become like a piece of furniture in the person's office. You call so much that when they answer the phone, they wonder if it's you, or they wonder if it's their wife. You call so much that you sometimes stop by and they say, "Oh, what are you doing here? Come on in, I'll be done in a few minutes, and then we can talk." And you always tell the truth about what you're doing. Your honesty will be reflected back to you. One character in my book, a former prosecutor named Tom Breen, who often didn't return my calls. He was a extremely busy top trial attorney in Chicago. But I would go to his office, and I would plant myself there for weeks on end. And eventually, I was sitting in client meetings and things, because he knew that I could be trusted and I wouldn't betray him. And I needed to use something, if I needed to use something confidential, I would talk to him beforehand. And we had a great rapport. Sometimes he would see me through a glass window when I would come in and ring the bell to his office, and he would scream, "Would you please stop bothering me?" And then he would let me in, and he was only half joking. So now let's go to a different locale. I want to tell you about Quitman County, Mississippi, which is the chapter that you read today. And I want to take you through the 3 steps of reporting on the ordinary. First is finding the problem. When I went to Mississippi originally, I thought that my book was going to be about indigent defense. And when I went to court, there was no line out the door like there was in Georgia. Right? In Georgia, people were just swarmed around the public defender. Here, there were only about 8 people straggling into court, and court only met 4 times a year. At the same time, I passed out my cards, and my phone's ringing off the hook, but I couldn't figure out a pattern to what was going on. And the stories all had to do with some sort of crime being committed. For example, woman at the librarian leans over the desk and says to me, "You know, my house was broken into 3 times in 1 week, and nothing ever happened. The police came, but the case was never prosecuted." Somebody in the school system starts telling me about all these abuse and neglect cases that somehow never have gone anywhere. But I couldn't seem to put together a pattern. So I went to the court clerk, who, as you know, is a woman named Miss Wiggs. She has a helmet of white hair and a very plain talking way. And I said to her, "Miss Wiggs, what's going on here?" And she says, "You want to know what's going on?" And she points to a list above her desk. And these are names of people who have been charged with crimes, and a judge has bound them over to grand jury. And in Mississippi, the way it works is that the prosecutor, by law, has to present all cases to grand jury. He can say, "This is not a very good case, I think it's weak, I think it's a waste of our time, I don't think it's really a crime." The prosecutor can tell the citizenry, you know, "This is what I think should happen in this case." And usually they would take a recommendation. But it's the citizenry. They're the check. They're the ones who decide if a crime has really been committed in their community. But what Ms. Wiggs found was that, you know, there would be 80 cases that should have come to grand jury, and then only 8 would go before the grand jury. And I said to her, "What happens to the rest of the cases?" And she said, "I have no idea." So I said, "Can I see your list?" So I took her list and I Xeroxed it, and I used it as a roadmap for what was going on in Greene County. And I met one woman who had been beaten up by her boyfriend with a tire iron underneath a bridge. Her daughter and her niece were inside a locked car watching. And at the scene of the crime, she had left a hair weave, a shoe, an article of clothing, and there was a police report that showed this. And there was a hospital report showing that she'd been in the hospital for several days, and it showed that she had blood on her face from the beatings. It showed the contusions on her back and the fact that she couldn't go back to work right away. She also moved out of her boyfriend's house the night after the crime. Why wasn't this case prosecuted? So I went and I talked to everybody. I talked to the police. I talked to the families. I did all this research. And then I went back to Ms. Wiggs, and she went back and she looked in the previous years and just saw, oh, there hasn't been a domestic violence case prosecuted in 21 years. Now, this gets to the number out of proportion, right? I had a woman who hadn't been prosecuted in 21 years. Now I needed to know how many cases the prosecutor was or was not prosecuting, and how that number matches up with other prosecutors nationally. Now, it was impossible to figure this out because counties across the country don't keep these kind of statistics, locally or nationally. I could never find another clerk like Ms. Wiggs who kept lists of cases that didn't go forward. But I did know that he prosecuted 24 to 35% of the cases by law that he had presented to grand jury. Now I was ready to figure out why this was happening and talk to all the players and make myself like a piece of furniture. Now, I went to the prosecutor and I said, here, I'm writing this book. It's about how courts do and don't work, and I'm interested in the issue of prosecutorial discretion. And here are these cases that I have that you decided not to prosecute. I'm interested in why you don't prosecute so many cases. And I gave him a bound volume of each case, and I said, let's go through it one by one. And we did this for hours and hours, and then I would call him back and say, well, what about this? And what were your reasonings? And basically what I figured out was that he really had no idea what his investigator was screening out. He did have feelings about domestic violence cases, that they weren't successful, and he directed his investigator to only bring him ones that could clearly be successful. For a big murder case that made the front page, he would go full hog. He would do anything he could to prosecute that case. But for the case that really affected the regular person that wasn't going to give him a lot of bang for the buck, he had a lot of resource problems, and he would just put cases aside, and he would not be bothered that there really hadn't been any individual attention or investigation into these cases. Now, right now, prosecutors don't have to explain to the public anything about how many people were charged and what the convictions were. The only scorecard we have are the win-loss records, and he was very concerned with his win-loss record. But this represents a very minor part of what prosecutors do. And for some reason, journalists across the country rarely look at what prosecutors do not decide to prosecute. Now, one problem with reporting on the ordinary is that it can really make you slightly mad. Because what you think is outrageous seems completely normal to everyone else. You really have to have your own eyes and believe what you see. The hardest chapter to write in the book is one of the ones you read today. It focuses on Hank Bauer. Bauer was extremely winning, extremely compelling person. When I would call Hank Bauer on the phone and say, hi, this is Amy, he would just smile, and he made you feel so good about yourself. It was such a delight to report on Hank Bauer, and he really was incredibly popular in Troy, New York. He was like a celebrity. When I first met him in 2005, he had recently won a landslide election to city council president. But what intrigued me was that just months before, the New York State Judicial Conduct Commission had kicked him off the bench as a city court judge. The commission had charged him with 51 infractions, including excessive sentences, coerced guilty pleas, excessive bail, and failure to notify defendants of their right to counsel. Now, let me just give you an example so that you can put a face to what I'm trying to tell you. Hank gave $25,000 bail to a homeless man for riding his bike on the sidewalk without a bell. Hank gave a woman who pleaded guilty after being arrested she was sitting on a stoop, basically, and there was a no loitering sign behind her. She didn't see it. She's braiding somebody's hair. Police come, see that she's sitting on the stoop with a no loitering sign. They arrest her. They give her Hank gives her a $25,000 bail. She ends up in jail for 8 days without an attorney. Her mother has to take care of her kids. She agrees to pay a couple $100 fine and to plead guilty to time served without a lawyer. She thinks, forget this case, screw them, I'll never pay the fine, this was just a bad day. She leaves, tries to apply for public housing a few months later, and she's denied public housing because she has a criminal record, and the only thing she had was this loitering conviction. Now, Bauer told me when he was going over the charges, he said to himself over and over again, where is the serious stuff? He just didn't think in his mind that that was a serious thing to do. After all, what was the big deal? Only 8 days in jail. And he could only have thought this way if the entire community was behind him. Now, you would think that a judge who gave really high bails and didn't assign people lawyers would be the talk of the public defender's office. But everyone loved Hank Bauer. He was the type of judge who would help a lawyer out. One lawyer remembered how Bauer helped the most beleaguered of clients, a toothless prostitute who kept getting rearrested. And every time she was arrested, he would release her because he felt sorry for her. So when a lawyer cared about a client, he would extend himself. Now, the problem is that the fair treatment didn't happen across the board. In the case of John Casey, who was basically a town drunk, Bauer would just plead him guilty without him even being in court. Say, oh, plea and time served, and then John Casey would wander back into court and say, what happened to my case? Why was I let out? Oh, you pled guilty. And he would walk out. He wouldn't make a sound. Now, it's up to you as the journalist and ethical attorney to see things with your own eyes, to believe your gut reaction. And as everyone, I mean everyone, is telling you what a wonderful guy Hank Bauer is, and you have to look at the facts and believe in yourself. And this becomes particularly difficult when everyone is telling you that there's been a mistake. There are moments of truth, and when you find them, you have to hold on to them because they're like a shaft of light. And for me, that came in the last chapter of the book when my main character gave me a real moment in the executive suite. He told me his true intentions. That chapter focuses on when the system marshals up all its forces because it wants to show a community that it wants to keep, that it's working to keep the community safe. These trials I call show trials because they're general front page stories and they're to show the community something. The prosecutor is a man named Tom Breen. In the 1970s, he prosecutes two 17-year-old boys for raping and murdering a little girl. Then about 2 decades later, after successfully prosecuting these two boys who get 200 to 400 years in prison, he's talking with a friend of his who investigates wrongful convictions, and the friend says, do you ever think you could have wrongfully convicted someone? And Tom Breen says, no. Then a few days later he comes back and says, you know what, I think you should look at this case. And based on Tom Breen's just saying, I think you should look at this case. Not anything negative about himself or the people he worked with, just I think you should look at this case. An investigation's launched, and after 27 years, those two boys, who are now men, are freed on the basis of DNA evidence. And I said to Tom Breen, why did you wait so long? 27 years is a long time. And he said, it's hard to rock the boat when you're in the boat. And I think that really is the whole point of ordinary injustice, that professional allegiances come to trump justice. What he's referring to is a community of law enforcement that really had strong ties. The reaction of former colleagues shows how strong those ties were. One said about Tom Breen, he is the most despicable human being that I know. Now, all Tom Breen did was say, you should look at this case. He didn't try and take down or hurt the people that he worked with. But by saying something that maybe we could have been wrong, he was in a sense bringing down all the mistakes of the past. many of his former colleagues still believe that the DNA evidence could have been wrong. And now, these are personal allegiances. They're everywhere. They exist in every institution: schools, law enforcement, medicine, accounting firms, banks, everywhere. And as journalists, and as lawyers for that matter, it's your job to see the invisible connections, to make sense of the senseless, to give hope to the prisoner who writes you a crazy-looking letter with misspellings, and to keep it on your desk until you have the time to look at it and listen. So what does reporting on the ordinary give you anyway? Invisible patterns so obvious that can't be addressed? No. Communities need to take back their courts. But the problem right now is that we can't change what we can't see. So the law students here today, I'd like to tell you that if you read my book, you'll be hedging yourself against the perils of the adversarial system, and you'll have this story in your mind, and maybe you won't be part of the collusion. But I don't think literature has that much power, and the truth is, unless you're some sort of missionary figure, you probably won't be able to do what Steve Bright did and stand up. And to the journalists and journalism students here today, I have devised a proposal that assumes that you're out of the picture. The book calls for monitoring and measurement so that we can see the kinds of errors that are being made. The leading scholars all agree that courts are the most unexamined public institution in America. No one's keeping track of what kind of cases do or do not go to court. We have no idea how many cases are being pled, what kind of crimes are being prosecuted or not prosecuted, and for what reasons, whether people are being forced to plead guilty without lawyers on a per-case basis across the country. Yet communities know how much we spend per pupil on education. And we know what that investment yields in terms of test scores, teacher-student ratios, and graduation rates. Reliable data does not exist in the same way for the courts. There's no test scores for courts as there are for schools. In sports, we keep track of every statistic in the world so that coaches can see how to improve the qualities of their teams. We need to do the same thing for the criminal justice system. Okay, I want to make one more plea for reporting on the ordinary, and not everybody has the time to do the kind of investigation that I'm talking about. We always need to be deeply aware of it, to take the outrageous story on the front page and take it down to the most basic level. Without the ordinary, we help paint a distorted picture of reality. So for a final story, I want to tell you about Joe Sullivan. You may have read about him on the front pages. He is the 13-year-old boy who was given life without the possibility of parole for burglarizing an elderly lady's home and raping her in Florida. The issue before the Supreme Court a few months ago, and it should be coming down soon, is whether such a young boy should ever have the chance to go before the parole board, or if it's a violation of the Eighth Amendment to say that he was 13 and is a criminal for life and with no hope for parole. So I got a copy of the trial transcript because I was going to do a story for Slate. And I was expecting boxes to arrive at my front door. Instead, there was a pamphlet. It was less than an inch thick. And the trial, it seemed, only lasted 8 hours. The lawyer for Joe Sullivan waived his opening statement. He also waived his closing statement. His closing statement was just a little bit of text. It was less than a page of text. He didn't cross-examine Joe Sullivan's good friend, who snitched on him, and who actually had a sex crimes record. And when the judge sentenced Joe Sullivan, the judge said, "When you get out of here, you're going to be a very old man." But he was sentencing him to life without the possibility of parole, which meant he would never get the chance to get out. No lawyer ever said, "I think there's some confusion here about life without the possibility of parole. Some judges are confused in a change of law." Let me tell you that life without the possibility of parole means no chance ever of getting out. No one stood up to say, "Are you sure this is what you meant?" I tried to find that lawyer who represented Joe Sullivan, but he had left the state of Florida because he had been disbarred. Now, the point here is there are all these stories on the front page, and they make America look like we're exceptional, that we allow sleeping lawyers in death penalty cases, that we allow 13-year-old boys to get life without the possibility of parole. And I truly believe that if we start paying attention to the ordinary as journalists and as lawyers, we won't see these kind of exceptional stories anymore. So I urge you, whether you're reporting or litigating, to think about the ordinary, because the ordinary is where it all begins. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy. We have time for questions, and then we're going to have a small reception just outside the classroom. So please, if you have questions, just raise your hand and Amy can call it.
Except for the Texaco case, you talked only about criminal law. Did you look at all its civil law cases?
First of all, my book is only about state criminal trial courts. And I have been talking about this around the country, and I've gotten so many people asking, to do something about family court, to do something about some federal sentencing guidelines, so many other things. There are so many other forms of ordinary injustice. But as I said, the problem of ordinary injustice, to really show the systemic level of it, is extremely difficult. And so I would really think twice before I ever did a project like this again. And I urge someone else to take on family court, immigration court. I'll give you some other ideas if anybody's interested. Yeah.
Would you say the disparities are more based on race or economic factors?
Clearly, race is an enormous part of the criminal justice system. I would never deny that. And I think economics also play an incredibly important role. I could not pick one or the other. And the way I dealt with race in the book is through stories. So, like in the chapter about Tom Breen, the prosecutor comes forward and says, I think I could have made a mistake nearly a decade later. I went and I talked to all his prosecutor friends and tried to get them to tell me, because the two boys that he convicted were African American. So I said, and they had this game, and it was called Niggers by the Pound. And what they would do is they would put every prosecutor's name up on a list, and they would weigh the defendants, and this had no legal meaning, and they would put next to each prosecutor's name how much somebody weighed they convicted, and the person who collected the most number of pounds won. And I would say to these former prosecutors who are now successful lawyers who had left the office, I would say, so why did you do that? And they would say, it was a game. It was not racist. It was something that we did. It was just competition. And I would say, but it's so horrible. Don't you look back on that? And they all didn't think of it that way. Tom Breen can't remember it, and maybe he's blocked it out. But the way that I tried to portray it in the book is to show through stories how it was a kind of ordinary injustice. They still couldn't take themselves down and say, yes, we did this thing and it was a terrible mistake and we weren't educated properly, we were ignorant. That was not in their vocabulary, even though it was obviously such a horrific thing to do.
In terms of broadcast news, how can you concentrate on the ordinary in a minute-and-a-half package? Or does that mean you have to change the system in the way news is constructed?
First of all, let's just broadcast news. Trying to publicize my book, Ordinary Injustice, has been close to, it is so hard to get. So you have so much power in broadcast news. So if you can give a couple-minute story and give a face to the statistics, you're doing such an enormous amount of good. And I know that sometimes in broadcast news, unless you're 60 Minutes, you don't have the time to do what I've done, to talk to, they're on crazy budgets. you would know how to better do it than I would, but take the print versions and make them come alive on TV. That's, I mean, it's such a noble thing to do, to be able to give a face to it and express it. You know, I was on TV just on C-SPANs. They taped my bookstore thing, and they did it. And the response I've gotten is enormous, of people writing in their stories of ordinary injustice. So if you have that kind of power, it's really your responsibility to show, you know, that it's not just this one judge in Florida who, you know, who commits a wrong sentence, or it's not just this one guy who doesn't. You have to pull back and give the national picture, and give people a sense of the importance and the weight of it. Just because you're doing broadcast doesn't mean that you're exempt from the ordinary injustice problem.
What do you propose we do with all this more information that we get? Like, what's the measuring stick? Is that kind of subjective? I mean, we already have traditional cities removing judges that have done something improper. We have Bach, and, you know, we have the Bar that will also remove lawyers that do unethical things. So I'm just a little confused about what do we do with all this information?
Well, the idea for the model measuring project is that we start figuring out what are the important statistics that show us that justice isn't or is not working. And there are people that have done this. There are people at the Kennedy School of Government who do this internationally in places that are way below, you know, obviously have enormous crime problems. We just don't do it in this country. So these people, we start figuring out ways to measure how many people are pleading guilty without attorneys, how many cases get set aside and for what reasons, how high are the bails and for what crimes, what are the costs of holding people in jail, what are the collateral consequences that I talked about, right? And you get these things and you make them in what they call a bundle, and it gives you a justice index, basically. And you can see on the web how things are improving or not improving. If for Hank Bauer's courtroom, for example, if they could show how many people every month were pleading guilty without attorneys, it would have taken the personality out of the problem, right? So you don't have this charming guy who's winning everybody over. Instead, you have these hard numbers. And Hank, you have to start assigning people lawyers. Look at your numbers. And then they would go up. It needs some sort of public visibility so that groups that care can have something to grab onto. Right now, there's nothing to show. I mean, if I hadn't found that random thing with Miss Wiggs and she had that list, I would have never even known to begun to look at what was not prosecuted or not prosecuted. But if prosecutors actually had to say how many cases they're prosecuting, how many cases they're not prosecuting, like right now all we have is their win-loss records. It doesn't really tell us anything. It doesn't tell us what they put aside. The idea is that if we start looking at these numbers and quantifying it, then we can tell them this is what we want or this is what we don't want. And the idea is that we do want something. Right now, I don't think the American, it's not even the radar screen of the American people to say that they want it. But people in law school care, students care. So hopefully, the idea is to create some sort of interest or movement in it.
Yeah, I hope this isn't a repeat. I haven't had an opportunity to read your text or the chapters that were written today. But you said that you chose to represent race by stories in your books. I don't know if you have actually hard numbers in terms of the racial disparity that you found in your patterns. And the question is why did you choose to represent it as stories instead of those hard numbers that actually speak to the disparities and might get people thinking differently as opposed to stories?
Well, if I had the numbers, I mean, what you're talking about, I mean, it's a work of journalism, right? I wrote a journalistic book. The conclusion is recommending metrics and monitoring. But to be the lone journalist who's out there like doing magnificent statistical analysis and trying to figure out, I mean, the courts don't keep the data. They don't have the data based on race. So, I mean, I don't even know how I'd begin to figure out unless I had access to federal data, and then I had a team of people who could help me with this. I mean, it's just not my expertise. But I would encourage someone who is interested in doing that to do it. You know, to find out in Chicago, you know, how many, I guess, how many of the wrongful conviction cases were based on race. I guess I could have done that, but it's incredibly, this is a big project. It's not something that one person, unless you have an enormous brain, can do. Yes.
I was wondering, it's kind of like the question I asked you at the lunch about how Hank Bauer was so popular and what do the people want, and it seems like in the Bauer article everybody kind of okayed what he was doing. And I'm just kind of wondering if it's, where's the budget going to come from, like, you know, to
Yep.
go and look at all this stuff. Like, I need a job. I'm going to graduate with 6 figures of debt. Like, but I don't know if social justice pursuits are going to pay off my loan, you know? So,
Yeah.
so that's the
So
question.
the question is,
Is there any money in it?
let me tell you, there is,
Look at your lawyer.
well, is there money in being a public defender? Is there money in doing this kind of work? You know, if you want to make money in the law, you know the way to go. But if you could decide, because even if you do decide to do that, you could end up being a judge, and you don't want to end up like Hank Bauer. And the reason is because Hank Bauer had good intentions. He just ended up going way, way south of normal. And it could happen to any of us, because everyone around you is like being a mirror, right? Everyone's reflecting you and saying, good job, when you're doing the wrong thing and the wrong thing and the wrong thing. And you may know in your heart of hearts, deep, deep down, but you can bury it so deep because everyone around you is telling you you're doing such a good job. And so I think that's one monetary reason, is that you don't want to end up in a community of injustice like that, because there's no amount of money that can restore Hank Bauer's reputation. He's been thrown off the bench, you know, for judicial misconduct.
He was immediately elected to public office.
Yeah, he was elected to public office. You know, he can't be district attorney now. He can't have a lot of public positions. A lot of doors have closed to him. You know, and also it's just something you would never want for yourself. Is there money in this? It's a long life. There's a long career ahead of you, and you will make money. You will make money, but you also have to do good along the way. You also have to, you know, because you have some means, you have capability to be here in this law school, right? And we all have a responsibility to do some for people who just don't have as much, you know.
Irresponsible lending might have gotten me here.
What?
Irresponsible lending? I don't know.
No, I don't mean lending. I mean,
maybe.
Yeah.
Touche.
Based on what you've seen, do you think that ordinary justice is attainable? Maybe in our lifetime? Or
Yeah.
like children's lifetimes?
I do. I think that there's some courts that work. You know, I think that there are places like Terry Everett's courtroom, and I think that there are places where people for a long time have tried hard and they've worked as teams and they've set up structures. I know it can. What I was really focusing on, there's places that fell so far below the bar, where it does become normal. And I think you have to try hard when you graduate law school to find a place that you can make a difference, and that, you know, if you're the lone person in Greene County, Georgia, like there's this paralegal in Greene County, Georgia in the book, and she's always standing up before the county commission and saying, this is terrible. Did you know that nobody ever gets to talk to their lawyer? She's always going, guess who gets fired, you know? That being that person is really hard. You need to find a place where you can speak up and not be the only one, where you can have a team of people behind you, I think.
It seems to me that this is a political right, not on your part, but on the judges and the prosecutors' part. If I was younger and wanted to be a prosecutor or a district attorney, the first thing I would do is say, show me the pages. Show me what you didn't do. show me what you could have done. Mr. District Attorney, who wants to be an incumbent district attorney, show me and the system what you didn't do. Show me the prosecutions
Right.
that you didn't, you just looked the other way, and this is what it's about, looking the other way. And I see it as a political way to make this thing correct. Get people who want to run for office, who feel they're capable of running for office, who are intelligent and insightful and articulate, and can beg the question. What you're really saying is, these people have not begged the question. And you've got to beg the question. And the only way that question gets begged, as such, is for the potential candidate to say, knocking on your door, kid, come to me with the real facts.
Yeah.
And I say, if there's a political party that can do that, that's willing to spend the time and the money and the effort and that inner energy, I think there's a logical point to my point. And until something like that happens, there's a lot of spinning of wheels going on here.
I was wondering if you could apply your critique of ordinary operations in courts to the media, because you're speaking from both sides, so you might have some insight into this. You said, for example, that the media does a terrible job of seeing systems. It falls over and over again for the bad apple fallacy, or the good apple fallacy. I guess they individualize things. Do you think that, and you described how to overcome that fallacy, but I wonder if you could give an account of why it is that so often the media speaks in terms of simply bad apples or good apples, rather than institutions and processes and structures. And do you think it's because on the media side there's a version of ordinariness, where everybody colludes and thinks they're doing a good job, but actually as reporters do a terrible job, so they all pat each other on the back and saying, we're really covering the news, guys. But really are kind of maybe in their heart of hearts knowing that they're not? Because, or do you think that the ordinariness that produces this bad result, which is improper and incomplete coverage on the media side, is driven by other reasons? It seems like there's a...
I think that's a great question. I think that, it's sort of the nature of the news, is that you need to have a villain or a hero. As Americans, we love that. We love to see people taken down. We love to see them being recreated. And I think that the media has a formula for how they do their stories. In broadcast news, there's always a formula. And I think that you get, just like in law, you get like your Robert Sorenstein, you got to get through your cases, and so you can go home early, and you don't want to brush up against people. I mean, so that you get to see them in the hallways. I think in media, there's this kind of congratulatory sense, like, got my story on the front page. And it's a lot harder, and it takes a lot of resources, like I did, and not a lot of people have the luxury of that, to go the layers beneath and to really scratch below the surface. And as the economics of the newspaper industry continue to plunge, I don't know how they're going to get the resources to do the ordinary injustice kind of, reporting. I said this earlier at lunch, when I began my book, I knew of all these great legal journalists who were doing this incredible work. And when my book came out, I wanted to send them my book, and most of them had gone, and they're the ones who are doing this kind of, in the trenches reporting. And yet they're still able to fill the front page and make it look like we're really doing the in-depth stuff. And sometimes the in-depth stuff doesn't make that much of a sound. You know, the incredible reporting series that was on the front page of the New York Times about the justice courts in upstate New York. Not much has really changed then, which is why I do think that the media is really important for getting the word out. But the work, I think, really has to be done by people in the legal profession to create some sort of monitoring and measuring project that newspapers can use. But I don't know if journalists are the answer to doing the assessments themselves, because it is, like, I don't know your name, like you asked, it's an incredibly complex statistical matter.
Well, that brings us to the end of our time. So please join me in thanking Amy Bach for so And we have just outside those double doors